My talk is called Rosetta Stone, the Alphabet, the Goddess, and Schizoanalysis. The title of my talk refers to a book by Leonard Shlain called The Alphabet versus the Goddess. Schlain's thesis has to do with the concept of logocentrism. And in my dissertation, I argue that logocentrism and its critique is misconceived. And my first Hjelmslev hybrid, which Ludmila mentioned, and my black pyramid schema is, among other things, a way of dealing with real logocentrism. So we'll talk about naive logocentrism in Schlain's book, the advanced critique of logocentrism in Derrida, Deleuze, and Guattari. And then at the end, we will return to the place of Hjelmslev in this picture and the prospects of synthesizing the radical Hjelmslevian critique of logocentrism with a more domesticated semiotics, as I propose to do in my dissertation. So today there is this watered down, popularized account of what is logocentrism. And in my view, Schlain's book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, is the perfect emblem of this wrong view. The idea is just that verbal language lends dominance to certain cognitive functions at the expense of other ones. And this probably or possibly gives an advantage to people whose brains are more inclined to use language. Shlain crucially goes a step further to say that the use of alphabetic language in culture puts women specifically at a disadvantage to men. So now you see here how we are already entering into some problematic territory. However, on the very basic claim of a symbolic representational matrix that by its very structure reproduces certain forms of domination, on this claim, my inclination is to say yes. And thus I have no real problem with the claim put forward already on the first page of Schlain's book. That is, quote, every society that has acquired alphabet literacy has become violently self-destructive a short time afterward. The madness, this madness has been associated with a virulent misogyny and spelled trouble for images, women's rights, goddesses, and right brain values. I have no problem with this claim in principle, even though there is no way this claim can be verified. And on top of that, how the whole right brain, left brain, hemispheric lateralization has been largely debunked. And of course, the biggest problem that the association of right brain cognitive functions with women per se is widely challenged. We will just leave these matters aside for now and focus on what I see to be the actual and serious flaw with Schlain's book, because it is by focusing upon this flaw that we may understand and acquire the tools for fighting real logocentrism, which semiotics provides us. The subtitle of the book gives us a clue right away about what this serious flaw is with his work. That is, the conflict between image and word. So when Shlain writes, quote, every time there has been a great advance in science and knowledge assisted by alphabet literacy, it has been associated with war, he is not just blaming language. He is also saying that the attendant decline in visual communication also leads to war. Further, when he writes that, quote, whenever the alphabet appears, so too does madness, he is saying that it is the decline of the visual that leads to madness, not just the presence of the alphabetical. Problems arise here regarding the obviously visual aspect of written language as text on the printed page. Also, Shlain claims that visual communication and cognitive processing favors women, but as even he briefly acknowledges in his introduction, studies do not entirely support the idea that women are more inclined to visual communication than men. Some studies show the opposite. Nevertheless, His argument proceeds upon this assumption that language use decreases visual communication, that women are predisposed toward the visual and men away from it, and finally that today's developments in visual communication through television and computer screens is a herald of a brave new future after alphabets will be defeated, a post-logocentric and thus post-patriarchal future. Referring to the learning disorder of dyslexia as a natural reaction to logocentric culture, Shlain predicts that, quote, as culture becomes more comfortable with its reliance on images, it may turn out that dyslexia will be reassessed as another of the many harbingers that announced the arrival of the iconic revolution. I read this passage with a tone of sarcasm because I do have serious problems with the whole idea of this iconic revolution, but I will again concede that his general claim that developments in telecommunications today are an indication of a techno-evolutionary event horizon of huge importance. This claim is incontestable as far as I am concerned. But I do still have this problem with the claim that multimedia visual communication itself will somehow save us from patriarchy and perdition, and that the old printed page is a relic of a bygone age that ought to be done away with as soon as possible. Indeed, on this point, some will tell you, many will tell you, that, for example, semiology, structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, and other linguistics-oriented branches of semiotics are themselves logocentric, and that they are therefore part of the problem because of their interest in language. A major claim of my dissertation, and one which I am stressing here, is that this disavowal of semiology and structuralism is a mistake. But you see, in this connection, how the replacement of language with images is not an effective strategy of fighting logocentrism, because images can also be logocentric. It is upon this basis that we can easily dismiss the common idea that multimedia brings any quick and easy solutions to this problem. But fortunately, though, the way in which Schlain's book falls prey to this mistake is actually quite entertaining. Take, for instance, his statement that the internet will solve all the problems of sexism and misogyny in popular culture. In the context of the late 90s appearance of personal computers, he writes that, quote, after a time, thanks to the internet, I predict culture will adjust and sexuality's place in culture will eventually reach a healthy equilibrium. But even beyond the more obvious stupidities such as these, there is another even more entertaining way in which Schlain's book exhibits its own logocentrism. And this is very instructive for us, for understanding logocentrism's true nature, the way that it manifests in any modality, including the visual, and the tools that semiotics gives us for fighting it. Moving from early Christian history through Roman times, the Dark Ages, medieval times, the Renaissance and the Reformation, and blasting through modern history, Shlain selects some of the sauciest historical periods and dwells on them at great length. He gives special attention to the heights of Roman brutality, torture and mayhem during the Inquisition, and the burning of witches in the 15th century, not restraining himself by any means to a dry account of dates, facts, and statistics. He gives vivid visual retellings, such as, for example, one particularly detailed account of the witch burning trials in chapter 32, which I found to be a bit gratuitous, to say the least. And all the while, of course, the reader is following his narrative and sympathizing with the suffering characters and thinking, yeah, damn alphabets. In addition to gratuitous violence, though, the effect of alphabet literacy, specifically upon human sexuality, also provides Shlain with some interesting or entertaining narrative possibilities. During his accounts of early Christian history and then the later Reformation, Shlain associates the practice of male celibacy with alphabetic literacy as a way of denigrating women. But in what seems to be his favorite historical period, that is the late 15th and early 16th century, this correlation is reversed. During this period, rather, sexual indulgence and decadence become the index of alphabet domination. As he writes, quote, "The principal Renaissance popes of the period, Sixtus IV, Innocent VII, Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, Julian II, Leo X, and Clement V, engaged in activities and made decisions that, taken as a whole, constitute one of the most dramatic examples of sustained folly in human history." And much like the retelling of the stories of the witch burnings, these graphic summaries make for a pretty good reading. No doubt this very graphic, selective, and visual aspect of his book contributes to the fact that it was indeed a bestseller in the United States of 1998. Incidentally, these portions remind me of some of these recent television productions like Showtime's Tudors, which was about Henry VIII's many exploits. Or better yet, another one of Showtime's programs, The Borgias. Yes, I have watched these shows. Yes, I enjoy these shows. But during these parts, Schlain's book is such a page turner that one barely pauses to question, again, the substance of this correlation between alphabetic literacy on the one hand and the excesses of these lusty popes and cardinals on the other. One reads on, quote, "Alexander's, that is Rodrigo Borgia's, bacchanals were the talk of Christendom. 50 courtesans danced after dinner with the guests, at first clothed, then naked. Candelabra were then placed on the floor and chestnuts scattered among them. The courtesans, still naked, crawled on their hands and knees among the burning candles to retrieve the chestnuts in invented ways, while the Pope, Cesar, and his sister Lucrezia looked on. I'm turning the pages, I'm nodding, and as I read, I see, very interesting, those damned alphabets." A side point here is that it's clear that Shlain is trying to be edgy and contemporary by including all this graphic sex and violence. But when it comes to the actual fight against logocentrism as such, things get a whole lot more edgy than Shlain is probably ready to deal with. When you start dealing with what I call total destratification, things get dangerously edgy indeed. But we'll get to that later. For now, when it comes to his visual writing style, you may disagree with me here by pointing out that, well, Schlain's book is not really visual communication, obviously, because it is still in the format of printed type. And so this example does not support my point that visual communication may also be logocentric. However, this leads me to the next part of my presentation, which is the more difficult part, to understand the logocentric aspect of the message, regardless of its modality, visual, auditory, or what have you, has to do with its uncritical representation of the referent. So I argue that Schlain's visual realism is uncritical in just this way, but now we move away from Schlain's book to more serious material in pursuit of the real definition of logocentrism. As Ludmila already told you, the real definition of logocentrism is a major concern of my recently published and defended dissertation, and there I engage with the texts of Jacques Derrida directly and at length. And in my first chapter, I quote him, or I'm quoting my first chapter, and this quote actually, this is a quote that Ludmila already gave. That is, logocentrism is the belief that the signified has a natural bond with the referent, and that while different signifiers are used in different languages, the signifieds to which these signifiers are correlated are the same for everyone across all cultures. And I point this out in my dissertation. I try to make it as clear as possible, because it should go without saying that the signifier does not provide us with the referent. One person speaks Spanish, another Estonian, a third only English, and each uses different signifiers for presumably the same thing, but the relationship of the signified to the referent is a more difficult question. Do we each have the same mental content? Are the differing signifiers that we each respectively use referring to the same content? Is there a universal mental content independent of language? Do the signifieds have a privileged bond to the referent? To answer yes, there is a mental content that is the same for all of us independent of language. This is logocentrism. And more complicatedly, there are certain conventions that reflect a logocentric outlook. One may call them realist conventions. Deleuze and Guattari call them representationalist conventions, but more about that later. For now, you may see simply how a painting or other visual communication may adhere to these conventions, or it may not, just in the same way as a written text may be representationalist, and it may not. My argument is that Schlain's book is logocentric in this way, and Derrida's book is not. So in the same way as images may be logocentric and non-logocentric, also some writing is logocentric and some writing is not. So when it comes to logocentric writing, Derrida explains that, quote, the system of language associated with phonetic alphabetic writing is that within which logocentric metaphysics determining the sense of being as presence has been produced. Limiting the internal system of language in general by a bad abstraction, it prevents Saussure and the majority of his successors from determining fully and explicitly that which is called the integral and concrete object of linguistics. So try to understand. The characters of alphabetic language reproduce the sounds of speech, unlike some ideogrammatic languages, for example, whose parts are not bound to this bad abstraction. Because of their dependence upon speech, Derrida argues that alphabetic language reinforces a notion of truth through presence in the voice. And in the logocentric view, meaning is in this way guaranteed by the linguistic identity of the speaker. The argument is that not only may there be a non-logocentric writing, but this writing itself, this non-logocentric writing, which is more or less the topic of Derrida's book, and for which Derrida's book stands as a colossal exemplar, the major exemplar. This writing itself, according to these fellows, is the most effective way of getting to the heart of logocentrism in every modality, written or otherwise. This is also the claim of Deleuze and Guattari, that semiotics itself may be conceived as a kind of anti-representationalist writing designed to fight logocentrism. And it is Deleuze and Guattari who no doubt have achieved the most lasting and impactful expression of this vision. It is a vision which is nevertheless quite difficult to understand. The style of this non-logocentric anti-representationalist writing is one that cannot be learned by imitation. As Deleuze and Guattari say, quote, that is what style is, or rather the absence of style, asyntactic, agrammatical. The moment when language is no longer defined by what it says, even less by what makes it a signifying thing, but by what causes it to move, to flow, and to explode, desire. For literature is like schizophrenia, a process and not a goal, a production and not an expression. Like Derrida and Julia Kristeva before them, Deleuze and Guattari point to the usual suspects, Marcel Proust, James Joyce, and especially Samuel Beckett. But such strategy of mentioning is also ineffective. These authors have also been canonized. They have also been absorbed into the mainstream. They themselves have become the convention of great literature, so to speak. Another point is to stress that this writing is not restricted to literature, but may also be found within theoretical and scientific writing. That is, Deleuze and Guattari's writing and Derrida and Kristeva's own writing is not just about the non-logocentric anti-representationalist writing. It is this writing. And crucially, any work that presumes to discuss this writing must also be a demonstration of this writing. And I uphold again that classically, at least from the Parisian view, this is precisely what semiotics as a discipline of writing was supposed to designate. Needless to say, Leonard Shlain's book doesn't quite achieve this height of self-awareness, but we shouldn't be too hard on Shlain because we agree with his basic thesis, and it is this thesis which, however imperfectly, explains why such anti-representationalist literature is necessary in the first place, even if it fails completely to realize this literature in its own style. Further, we shouldn't be too hard on Shlain, because as Deleuze and Guattari write again, quote, every writer is a sellout. The only literature is that which places an explosive device in its package, fabricating a counterfeit currency, causing the superego and its form of expression to explode, as well as the market value of its form of content. From the vocabulary in this quote that is form of expression, form of content, we also see again that it is Louis Hjelmslev who inspires Deleuze and Guattari's semiotics, in the very same way that it was also Hjelmslev who inspired Derrida's deconstruction in certain parts of it. You may respond now by saying, well, Deleuze and Guattari weren't semioticians, or Deleuze and Guattari weren't interested in deconstruction. And this is a common attitude. Our work is often actually described exactly as a critique and even a rejection of semiotics, deconstruction, and psychoanalysis. And perhaps the most useful thing that I can say to you, aspiring young semioticians in the audience right now, is that by understanding Hjelmslev as the theoretic foundation, we may also understand how semiotics subsumes deconstruction, schizo, and psychoanalysis, and may be perceived in this way with a more coherent disciplinary identity. In any case, Deleuze and Guattari do not reject semiotics. They repeat word for word the definition of logocentrism that Derrida already gave us, which is that in alphabetic language, truth is secured through being grounded by presence in the voice. Their words in Anti-Oedipus are as if peeled directly from the pages of Grammatology. As they say, logocentric writing, quote, implies a use of language in general according to which graphism becomes aligned on the voice, but also overcodes it and induces a fictitious voice from on high that functions as a signifier. Whereas these non-representationalist writers like D.H. Lawrence, Marcel Proust, and Samuel Beckett, quote, possess a graphic system that is independent of the voice, a system that is not aligned on the voice and not subordinate to it, but connected to it, coordinated in an organization that is radiating, as it were, and multidimensional. Further, Derrida, as well as Deleuze and Guattari at the same time, equally remind us that images can also be logocentric. And so from their view, visual communication and multimedia is no guaranteed solution to the problem. And they describe their own goal, partially at least, as an attempt to purge from theory this logocentric imagery. And this is the real basis of what they call schizoanalysis. In their assault on logocentric imagery, Deleuze and Guattari go even deeper than the critique of race, class, and gender. And this is where things get really troubling or edgy. This is where it gets edgy. So they are interested in finding something even more central to identity than these earlier categories. And the result is that their choice is that with schizoanalysis, they deconstruct the very notion of the nuclear family structure itself. So in chapter 4 of Anti-Oedipus, in some of the final pages of the book, they define schizoanalysis in this way, quote, "The fundamental difference between psychoanalysis and schizoanalysis is the following. Schizoanalysis attains a non-figurative and non-symbolic unconscious, a pure abstract figural dimension, apprehended below the minimum conditions of identity." What are the minimum conditions of identity? Identity as structured by race, class, and gender is already obvious. From the beginnings of post-structuralism, it was already clear that these pillars should be the central targets of the critical project, and that their deconstruction is elementary to the achievement of non-identity. But Deleuze and Guattari want to take it a step further. This next step is one that most would-be progressives are not willing to take or even consider. And I emphasize this further step because it is only by contemplating such radical destratification that one can come to understand the real source of the dangerous mystique of semiotics. The theoretical argument from Deleuze and Guattari is that the so-called Oedipus complex may stand for the role of family-based repression and transference within psychoanalytic treatment. The psychoanalyst is likely to explain symptoms of the patient on the basis of the patient's relationship with their family. Deleuze and Guattari explain how the family then is like the actors or performers in a little tragic theater production, which is the same for everybody, just like the signified is supposed to be the same for everybody in logocentrism. In this way, old psychoanalysis remains representationalist, and the goal of schizoanalysis is to purge it of this privatized theater of the family. Deeper than race, deeper than class, deeper than gender, the family structure and its visual representation is the basis of real logocentrism, or so say Deleuze and Guattari. At this point in my argument, I like to rely upon the unmatched eloquence of Julia Christe to explain this process, how going through the experience of this crucible exposes the subject to impossible dangers, relinquishing his identity in rhythm, dissolving the buffer of reality in a mobile discontinuity, leaving the shelter of the family, the state, or religion. The commotion this practice creates spares nothing. It destroys all constancy to produce another, and then destroys that one as well. When we consider the direction that semiotics sometimes has taken towards embodiment wellness and feel-good philosophizing, like what Shlain does, or toward more romantic notions of simply getting back to nature, comments like this one from Kristeva should give us pause. Also, we must consider the meteoric rise of Deleuze and Guattari in the social sciences. They are perhaps the most cited authors in the trendy field of posthumanism, for example, even when they are concluding their most important works with a warning like, quote, "Schizoanalysis must devote itself with all its strength to the necessary destructions, destroying beliefs and representations, theatrical scenes, and when engaged in this task, no activity will be too malevolent." For the main part of my presentation, I would just close by saying that the dangerous mystique of the word semiotics is very real, but in order for that currency not to lose its luster, there has to be some accountability to what we may call the total destratification at the heart of the semiotic enterprise. But immediately I want to qualify this extremism. Moderation is advisable. Accountability does not preclude happy cooperation in instrumental projects and social initiatives. The major point of my dissertation was to show how after we fully understand the destratifying impulse, integration is still possible with scientific semiotics, for example. This is the whole ambition of my first Hjelmslev hybrid and Black Pyramid schema. With this in mind, I will read this quote from Deleuze and Guattari about the importance of Hjelmslev. And then to conclude, I will pose some questions about the legitimacy of the radical reading of Hjelmslev and the prospects for integration with Peirce. So this is from Hjelmslev. I mean, this is from Deleuze and Guattari about Hjelmslev, about why they love Hjelmslev. We believe that from all points of view and despite certain appearances, Louis Hjelmslev's linguistics abandons all privileged reference, because these figures have definitively lost the minimum conditions of identity that define the elements of the signifier itself. In short, Hjelmslev's very special position in linguistics and the reactions he provokes seem to be explained by the following: that he tends to fashion a purely immanent theory of language that shatters the double game of the voice graphism domination, that causes form and substance, content and expression to flow according to the flows of desire. So then, I have two general summary points and then two questions. The first point is that the critique of logocentrism is not reducible to the question of multimodality or multimedia, nor is the problem of logocentrism merely a problem of verbal language. The second point is that the primarily linguistic solution posed by semiotics for the problem of logocentrism is deeply implicated with total destratification. So then my first question is directed to everyone. Or I suppose it's directed especially to those who read my dissertation or are aware of this first Hjelmslev hybrid here and may, I don't know, have thoughts about whether it's feasible. So this question is, to what extent may this whole Peircean iconic turn of scientific semiotics be reconciled with the goals of deconstruction and schizoanalysis? And finally, my final question is directed at Ludmila, as it regards Hjelmslev. It's also directed at our host Israel, too, expert in Hjelmslev and in Prieto. There's also named Louis, the other Louis. I ask you, Ludmila and Israel, are there indications of radical destratification, as I describe it, already in Hjelmslev's own texts? Or further, regarding Prieto, Louis Prieto is Israel's main focus area in his PhD, and Prieto is a Hjelmslevian. Prieto has a definite political radicalism of his own, and so I guess the question is, I mean, is Prieto reading too much into Hjelmslev in the way that I do, or in the way that arguably Deleuze and Guattari do, or even Derrida already does when they emphasize this idea of either reciprocal presupposition or already this total destratification, as it's called in the late game. So I'm stopping the share screen and opening the floor to our 35 beautiful participants. And as long as you don't mind being recorded, then you should turn on your cameras.
Indeed, and you can. Okay, yeah, I guess I am. You can hear me, right? Yeah. So yes, we really bring all your questions. Now is the time to do it, because so after this almost 2 hours, I'm sure you have a lot of questions. And if there is not a question right now, there was already one in chat. Maybe we can start quickly with that. It was by Victoria. I hope she's still there. And the question was for Ludmila. And the question was, what's the place of abstract concepts in Jens's theory, and how would he explain the meaning of adjectives or verbs? Not only.
Someone's saying I can't hear you in the chat, but I can hear you.
Yeah, well,
yeah, but I can hear you twice. Can you guys hear me? Yes. You can hear Israel, right? Okay. So let's just do counter. Okay, yes, Ellie says yes.
Good.
Okay, so then what's your answer, Ludmila, to Victoria?
Oh, okay. First of all, thank you for the question, Victoria. I'm sorry if it was not clear from my presentation. I somehow had difficulties to approach himself in this rather short talk. Even at the end, it was not that short. But of course, Helmslow's theory is like a theory for the whole linguistic system. Is a very structuralist theory from the first generation of semiology. They treated language as the whole system, where it is presupposed that it will include all the concrete and abstract notions, of course, at the level of the content. And what I tried to demonstrate with the example of elephant was that actually at the level of the substance of the content, we have different substances of semantics, different semantic substances, not only for the physical objects, physical natural objects, but as well as for the abstract contents or abstract entities. But I gave it for clear that, of course, there are different substances for abstract notions because it is very culturally dependent. And I focus on the physical objects because this is more tricky when it comes to different substances of content. And the second part of the question, Helmslaw was first of all linguist, so he treated all the morphological categories, adjectives, verbs, and of course he focused on Danish and French, and he was more interested in nouns actually than in adjectives or verbs, because also the theory I mentioned, the theory of participation law or the participative opposition theory, comes from morphological studies on the case system. So I don't know whether this answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Just I wanted to maybe to go to the examples. I'm doing the dissertation about authenticity, and I'm curious how to actually illustrate with himself the meaning, so to say, of the word authenticity, or let's say, I don't know, liberty or something.
Okay, so if you are asking concretely whether he has some definition of authenticity of other abstract notions, so I would say no, because he was interested in linguistic structure more than the very particular semantic aspects of concrete words.
No, just I want to specify that I'm not interested in himself's idea of authenticity, but because I imagine that he didn't do that. But in the case of the word like authenticity, is it an expression or it's a content, or what kind of things is that? Like, if you understand me.
I think I understand. I would say that is any linguistic sign. The word authenticity is both expression and content, of course, because it has all the four components of the schema. Like it has expression and content and form and substance. So the question only is how to define the very form of the content, maybe not that much of the expression in your case. So, but like, yes, you can use all of the four components of the schema to describe semantics of a word.
What to do with like with concepts that are not presented like in other cultures, or whether they are just meaningless, or what does it mean?
I wouldn't know whether there is such a case that a word is non-existent in a given language. I would say that you can try to find some equivalence, as I did with the Japanese word kokoro, because some people would say it doesn't exist in English. Well, in a sense, it doesn't, but you can still translate because, of course, we have translation from Japanese to English, so somehow the translators can manage. And it is just upon to your imagination how you will define the very form, the semantic form of this word authenticity in other languages. Like the form will be different probably, but I wouldn't say that the word doesn't exist in a particular language.
Thank you.
What do you think about this?
Yeah, I very much agree with Ludmila, because indeed form might be different, but there is a possibility of translation, and I was actually during either yours or Ludmila's presentation, this I was thinking about this, that at some point there seemed to be a very, I think maybe it was during yours, because I thought that it was kind of like a very radical position, almost relativistic position, or somehow the question of whether there is intelligibility between languages seem to come up, and well, I think there is. So of course it might not be possible to say exactly the same things in every language. So for instance, I know that there are some Spanish speakers in the audience, so I will use a Spanish example. So how do you translate John Lennon's Imagine to Spanish when he talks about heaven? So of course in English you have heaven and you have sky, but in Spanish you only have one word, cielo, and you can, I don't know, you can use paraíso or something else, but then it doesn't really fit with it doesn't really fit with the whole song. So there are differences indeed. But nevertheless, I would think that there are strategies to allow for, allow for understanding. Yes, I will try to fix my microphone, but please, yeah, okay, but yes, but please, some more questions from the audience. Are there any more questions? Yeah. Okay. Good. I didn't. Okay, that's good. So because if there are no questions, I would like to ask something to both of you. Yeah. So. First, I wanted to ask something to Ludmila, and well, but also to Tyler, because you are both talking about reciprocal presupposition, but specifically to Ludmila, does reciprocal presupposition mean the same thing than that participation, or not? And second question, only for Ludmila, would be whether participation law in Jemslev, it is equivalent to complementarity, to the Jemslevian notion of complementarity, because I know that some people have they have pointed out that Jemslev he introduced participation law in his work about cases, which is like one of the earliest works of him. But then in Prolegomena, it seems like this notion it is not there. But I think that it might be there as complementarity. and well, this kind of relates to this reciprocal presupposition. But so what do you think? And I'm sorry because it might be a too technical question, but yeah.
I know, Taylor, do you want to answer first?
So you're the expert. You should definitely be the one.
Not an expert. But first before I answer your question, Israel, I just have a comment because you mentioned the relativity. So I think it is not really the case of linguistic relativity in Hjelmslav, because in my understanding, it's the contrary. Like the traditional Sapir-Whorf explanation of linguistic relativity is that the language form determines the speaker's viewpoint or understanding of the world, right? But when I was reading Hjelmslav, I had the opposite impression of that it is not the form determining the speaker's viewpoint, but it is rather like the contrary, that the culture or the cultural artifacts, as he says, determine the language form rather. But I don't know whether I'm correct here. And I already forgot your first question, sorry.
It was about
is it the same as participation the same as reciprocal presupposition?
Yes.
No, it is not. It was just my invention to put those two things together. Like he himself doesn't use the word, neither reciprocal presupposition, neither retroactivity. And participation is so like marginal in Hjelmslav. It is mostly present in his earlier writings. And so I would say it is not the same thing. In my understanding, we can relate the two things because it's somehow one thing presupposes the other. Like in order to have the retroactivity, I think it is good to have the participative relation between form and substance, but it is not the same. And the second question, whether it's the same with the what was the second question? Whether it is
whether participation was present in the prolegomena as complementarity. So
well, maybe yes. If you want, we can understand complementarity as participation, but I think that participation is something more general, and complementarity would be only one particular demonstration of participation. Maybe that I don't know.
Good. No, but that's very good. Yeah, thank you.
Should I hit this question that's in the chat?
Yes.
So Gary Mostaho poses in the chat. He says his mic's not working. Otherwise, he poses it vocally. He says, question to Tyler. Regarding the positions of Derrida, Kristeva, and Deleuze, is there a dividing limit between logocentrism as phenomenological problem and logocentrism as linguistic or semiotics problem? Linguistic or semiotics problem. Well, maybe as if you want, we can understand complementarity as participation. But it is not the same. In my understanding, we can relate the two things because it's somehow one thing presupposes the other. Like in order to have the participatory relation between form and substance, but it is good to have the participative relation between form and substance, but it is not the same. the interesting question here, I think, is the interesting situation is that to excise logocentrism at the phenomenological level is a colossal task. And I mean, it's like the task, I mean, it's so difficult to describe. It's like the task of all Hermetic philosophies. And it's all over the Old Testament and like the Kabbalah and everything. The idea of actually liberating phenomenological meaning from dependency upon a presumed referent. This is like the idea of the possibility of the truly transpersonal, for example. And the idea is that it's only through language, or at least this is what Derrida would say. It's only through language that we can even prescind the problem, because it's only linguistics that has a high enough degree of articulation, or language, I should say, that has a high enough degree of self-articulation that these ideas can even be parsed. But the goal indeed would be to excise logocentrism at the phenomenological. Right? But their argument, so language may be part of the problem. Language reinforces logocentrism, at least so say Derrida, phonological language, alphabetic language reinforces logocentrism through its very structure, and thus is part of the problem. But it is indeed only by and through language that the phenomenological problem of logocentrism can even be tackled.
Okay.
So let's see if he wants to type something. Are you still there? Thank you. Yes, no problem. Okay.
Now, Kalevi has raised hand, so please.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, both presentations were absolutely excellent and very, very enjoyable and interesting. So, but about about understanding logocentrism, so here Tyler's proposal is, in a way, to generalize the concept of logocentrism. But now, what would you think about this kind of maybe even further generalization, that logocentrism is a feature of that kind of modeling which forgets the freedom what is existing in the object, what is modeled. So that freedom has been in a way described in structuralism via the concept of arbitrariness of the structure. So because arbitrariness itself is a kind of freedom, but it was limited by it. So the true freedom, it is very hard to describe, so to say. This is what now Derrida is trying to do, Christo is trying to do, really, in a way. So I think this is still something very deep in the method of modeling itself, say because the means of the modeling we have basically are linguistic so much that but that is one of the fundamental methodological problem of semiotics, say, to try to find means to access that deep freedom, what is there in all in living beings, I would say, in a certain extent. What would you think of that kind of, let's say, definition even of logocentrism, a generalized one?
Absolutely, yeah. I might even define logocentrism just as the foreclosure of the incompatibility, as you would call it. But it's really interesting that you attribute this incompatibility to the object, right? The foreclosure of the internal incompatibility of the object, right? And this is, I mean, this is a way of describing that it's closer to biosemiotics, but it's profoundly true. I would also point out that it's profoundly Hegelian. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. I agree completely though, with what you say. What about you, Ludmila? What do you think?
I would also agree. Like, I'm not the expert in logocentrism, but I think it is a very nice definition to relate it to the freedom and arbitrariness in language, but which is only a limited version of the freedom that exists in living organisms. So I like it very much.
So there was another comment in the chat.
And there is, okay.
Oh, Gary has something to say. Hello, Gary. In a long time.
Hi, I'm obsessed right now about the pervasiveness of the Cartesian worldview in ways that affects everything. And I'm wondering, this is just an idle question off the top of my head. Do you see that logocentrism, as we understand it, is linked to the Cartesian worldview?
I mean, the easy answer is, of course, yes. And this is a classic talking point of semiotics, especially Persian semiotics.
Right.
To attribute what we call logocentrism to mind-body dualism. Right. And of course, that's fundamentally true. I mean, it's true. But I think it's a bit too easy. And as far as blaming Descartes for this. And another way of seeing it, I mean, it kind of depends on what your view on embodiment is. Maybe consciousness is embodied.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe consciousness cannot be programmed or turned to something else, released from its substrate. I would like to think this. I fear the technological event horizon. I do not want to be absorbed. I like bodies, right? Nevertheless, we have to be open to the possibility that consciousness is possibly disembodied. Like It could indeed be. And that could indeed be where this is all going, this technological event horizon that we're all happily participating in right now. Like consciousness could indeed leave the body. And maybe so. And I hope not, but nevertheless, like that could be true. And in that case, it's mind-body dualism and there's no problem. So that's just one example of how we can't reduce this problem to the Cartesian issue. But the answer is yes. And I would actually rather hear you. What is your position on Descartes and logocentrism, if you have something to say about it?
Well, I'm actually in the note stage of an article that I'm calling the Cartesian stain, where if you think of like a bowl of oatmeal and you drop it on the floor, the oatmeal that goes on the hardwood is a mess that you can clean up. But the oatmeal that goes on the rug is a stain, which is a much deeper question. And I wonder how much of our critique of Cartesianism is the critique of the mess and not the stain. Does that make any sense? Have we looked deep enough into this aspect? Just a random thought.
I like the metaphor. Nice.
I'm thinking the science fiction writer Fred Pohl, and I had the fortune to interview him once, and he was a futurist. And I said, what characterizes a genuine futurist? He said, any idiot could have predicted the impact of the automobile on the formation of suburbs and things like that. He said it would have taken a much keener mind to take a look at the automobile and think about dating, which has probably had more of an impact than all this. I have just one kind of other question, then I'll shut up. What do you think, if any, the relationship of Sebeok's insistence that language is a species-specific activity solely to humans? And do you think that concept privileges logocentrism?
Crucially, no. mean, I think again is to reduce the problem to terms which are misleading.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that that is actually to accord too much importance to language, right? As if it really were special and distinct, and that to deny it to other species is as if to cut them out of the privileged experience of the human experience, when in fact it is just yet one of a number of different modeling systems. And Sebiak wanted to keep the specificity of language instead of generalizing it to include all signifying systems. And you lose something either way you slice it, of course. But I would say that this is not anthropocentrism. Like, this is not, I mean, it's not just my position. I've given that one a lot of thought, actually, and it kind of depends. This one's open to it's open to dispute. It's widely disputed.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
I just popped into my head, so I don't have any solid thought on it right now. So
yeah, I think they get that question when people call that description, that is the description that language is human specific. When they call it anthropocentrism, I think they're getting the discussion backwards. They're getting it. Mm-hmm. Well, especially because, at least, I mean, to think of Sebiak's system as being anthropocentric itself is, I mean, you'd have to really misread Sebiak.
Right. But people, that doesn't stop some people, though, does it?
I know. No, it really doesn't. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course.
So we have another raised hand, Armando. Are you there still?
Hello to everyone. Armando Treviño here speaking from Mexico. I'm glad to be here sharing this time with all of you and to listen to all of the knowledge you have to share. And I have a question for Ludmila. I'm very interested in this concept of substance about James Lev's work, you know? And so my question will be like, what will be your recommendation on that notion of James Lev, the substance? I mean, is there, let's say, some kind of another idea that he had earlier, and then he came up to the conclusion of notion? Or I don't know, like, I would like you to show me, like, with your knowledge, where can I go to read more about that notion and concept? Because, you know, it is something so familiar to me that I have been experimenting with it on fine arts, on music and theater. And for me, it is like, wow, someone else thought about it, you know? I haven't read about it, but I want to. So I think that I will first need to read about this man so wise. And can you tell me something about it?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Armando. Thank you very much for this question. I'm really not an expert in Hills now, despite all what Tyler said, but maybe Israel knows more about the history of the notion of substance in Hills. But as far as I know, it was first widely described in Prolegomena, and in all the early writings, it was not really present. All the earlier writings were more about the morphological system or the linguistic system itself in the very structuralist manner. And of course, you will find a lot of approaches of applying Hills life to music or visual arts. I think there are, even not that numerous, but you will find something if you want. But he himself was only focused on language. And if you want to read more about the notion of substance, I would like maybe recommend other authors, not he himself, because he was really focused on language. So if you want to apply to other semiotic systems, I really recommend the reading of Tyler's dissertation because it is very inspiring in this direction. At least it was for me. I don't know, Israel, do you have a better answer to this question?
No. Well, just I will take advantage of the fact that you are Mexican, and no, because some years ago, the Universidad de Puebla, so they have a journal called seminar notebooks, cuadernos del seminario, and they no tópicos del seminario. I'm not sure, but there is an issue about the problem of immanence, starting with James Lev, and all those articles are in Spanish, of course, and they are discussing precisely the problem of the relationships between form and substance in James Lev. Well, mostly in James Lev also they talk a little bit about Greimas and other semiotic traditions, but maybe there you can also find some interesting things, and of course in the Prolegomena, I'm not sure to which extent this the category of case, it has some something about like some very primitive form proposal of form and substance, because I think I mean, of course this kind of comes from Saussure, well, from this statement that langue is form and not substance, but so I'm not sure to which extent in the category of case, the first was it the first of James Lev's books, or it was among the first ones? I'm not sure to which extent there is already something there. But well, of course, the Prolegomena, they are, and they are in Spanish. You can find them in Spanish. And yeah, I wanted to, so there are some questions in the chat, and I would ask you to write. I mean, there are some like petitions in the chat. So I would like you to, I would like to tell you that you can always write to semiosalong@gmail.com, and you can, because I think that you want some links of where you can find some texts. So yeah, you can send, you can write to us there, and we will provide the links or possibly the text if we have them. And yeah, and I don't know, are there more questions? Or
I see Mark and Miriam down here. You guys, the late joiners. If you don't have a question, Mark and Miriam, then I'm going to oh, my mic's on. Sorry, my mic was off. My mic's on now. Mark and Miriam down here. Mark's going to be one of our next presenters, one of the two next presenters in 2 weeks from now. And so, Mark, what are you going to talk about in your presentation? Turn off your mic, or turn on your mic.
Yeah, I can give a short introduction. So I'm going to make a bit of a sharp turn from the topic, perhaps, because I will talk about interlappings and possible collaborations of cultural data analytics and cultural semiotics. And perhaps the bit of transmutation part is is the aspect of how actually dealing with data and visualizing and using computational approaches, how you go perhaps from one form to another. But my own top interest goes towards the concept of cultural other. But the main idea is how do these cultural semiotics and cultural data analytics fit together.
Word, and that's going to be on the 29th of April. 29th. Yeah. I'm putting down here in the chat for everybody, this is my link tree, because in this link tree, you'll find a link to the Semiosalong blog, which is where all the future, everything is there, and the whole archive of all the Semiosalongs back into the prehistory are there. And also there's a YouTube channel where you're going to be able to find this presentation and a bunch of other shameless self-promotional material, such as my dissertation, which someone requested it in the chat. Okay, so then Israel's last words.
Yeah, so I guess indeed it is a very good time. So yes, we still had a lot of topics that we didn't really tackle, but well, we can do it some other time. Hopefully, I know that there are some people here who I'm sure that we are going to meet at some point, hopefully in some gatherings or something. I hope so. And yeah, so well, basically, I would only like to remind you that indeed, next 29th of April, we are going to have Mark Metz and Andrew Creighton. Mark, I will tell the official title of your presentation is going to be cultural data analysis plus cultural semiotics on describing the dynamics of otherness. And Andrew's presentation, oh, I don't have the name here, but it was a very cool name. It had to do with Umwelt and implosion, and he's going to talk about formal rationalization, and it's going to be a very nice session, and it will, I think, it will really cohere almost as nicely as this one did. So yes, we are very much looking forward to Umwelt, implosion, and enchantment. There you go. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yeah. So yes, so thank you a lot, and hope to see you in 2 weeks. And yeah, thanks for joining.
I'm going to leave the channel open for the next 10 minutes with some more techno music, so you can party with us.
Yeah, or so.